Belle had carried half the valley on her back. Children learned to ride on her. Neighbors borrowed her for trips to town when their own stock was lame. Travelers passing through, strangers who'd never sat a horse in their life, were handed her reins without a second thought, because everybody who knew Belle said the same thing: that Mare wouldn't put a foot wrong if the world was ending around her. 3 days after widow Constance Finch disappeared, Belle refused every rider who touched her saddle. By Christmas, people had stopped asking why and started wondering instead if the horse knew something they didn't. Constance Finch had been a widow 12 years by the time she vanished, ever since her husband died of a fever that took half the eastern end of the valley one bad spring. A hard man by most accounts, exacting rather than cruel, the kind who measured a household's worth in how little it troubled him. She'd stayed on alone at the small farm after that, working the few acres herself with the help of one hired man during planting and harvest, and the valley had long since settled into thinking of her as a fixture rather than a mystery. The widow Finch, kind but private, the kind of woman who'd give you eggs off her own table but never quite let you pass the porch. There was one habit of hers that the valley noticed without ever quite remarking on, the kind of thing a neighbor files away without thinking much of it until much later. Once a month, near enough to track by the calendar if anyone had cared to, Constance saddled Belle and rode out alone for the better part of a day, and came back toward evening offering no account of where she'd been. Nobody asked, not directly. It wasn't the valley's way to press a widow on her comings and goings, and there seemed no harm in it. She always came back, always settled, always picked the next morning's chores back up as if nothing had happened. But the hired man, looking back on it later, said he could count on one hand the number of times she'd ever told him where those rides took her, and that she'd never once offered the information unasked. After her husband died, people expected her grief to ease in time, the way grief generally did, and expected her, sooner or later, to remarry or move closer to whatever family she had elsewhere, or simply fold herself back into the ordinary rhythms of valley life. None of that happened. She stayed. She farmed her small acreage with the hired man's help and kept her own counsel. And the years passed, and the valley settled into thinking of her widowhood not as a wound still healing, but as simply who she was, a fact of the landscape, same as the ridge behind her house or the bend in the creek below it. If there was more to it than that, nobody in the valley had reason to suspect it. That was the part people kept returning to afterward, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone looking for something underneath. That 12 years was a long time to live beside a person, to wave to her on the road and trade pleasantries after church, and still know almost nothing true about what she carried. The one constant in her life, the thing everybody could agree on, was Belle. The mare had come to her not long after her husband's death, a gift or a purchase nobody quite remembered which, and from the start the two of them had seemed matched in some way that went beyond an ordinary owner and her horse. Constance rode her into town for supplies. She rode her out to check the back fence line. She rode her, some evenings, simply for the riding, out along the ridge road and back before dark, for no reason anyone could name beyond the plain pleasure of it. People who saw them together more than once or twice noticed a particular ease between the two of them that didn't quite match the ordinary working relationship most farmers had with their stock. Constance talked to the mare the way some people talk to themselves, low and constant, not the brisk command a person gave a work animal, but something closer to conversation. Belle, for her part, would follow her around the near pasture without being led, the way a dog might, and stood patiently at the porch rail most mornings waiting for whatever scraps Constance saved back for breakfast. A neighbor woman, recalling it later, said she'd once asked Constance, half in jest, whether she talked to that horse more than she talked to people. Constance had laughed, the neighbor said, and answered that the horse never repeated anything back to her wrong and never asked questions she didn't care to answer. The neighbor hadn't thought much of it at the time. She thought of it often afterward. The mare's gentleness was, by valley reputation, close to legend. Mothers who wouldn't trust their children near most farm stock made an exception for Belle without a second thought. Otis himself had handed his own granddaughter up onto her back the summer before, a girl of 6 who'd never sat a horse in her life, and watched the mare carry her twice around the yard at a walk so careful it seemed almost deliberate, as though she understood the weight on her back was smaller and more precious than what she usually carried. It was the kind of horse, people said, you'd trust with anyone's child, anyone's grandmother, anyone at all. That reputation was part of what made the refusal, when it came, so hard for the valley to make sense of. A skittish animal acting strange after a fright was one thing. The gentlest horse in 3 counties suddenly refusing every soul who approached her was something else entirely, and it sat wrong with people in a way that was hard to name precisely. Even as everyone agreed something about it didn't add up. Nobody in the valley could remember seeing one of them without the other for more than a day or 2 running. Nobody remembered seeing one without the other. The morning it happened was unremarkable in every way that mattered, right up until it wasn't. A neighbor boy, sent over to return a borrowed plow blade, found the house quiet at an hour when Constance was reliably awake and about her morning chores. He knocked. Nobody answered. The door stood unlatched, the way doors in that country often did, and after a minute's hesitation, he pushed it open and called her name into the front room. The kitchen told its own story, though nobody could read much into it that morning beyond plain wrongness. A pot of mush sat on the cold stove, half stirred, a wooden spoon still standing in it. A cup of coffee, gone cold, sat on the table with perhaps 2 swallows missing. Her good wool shawl, the one she wore for any errand beyond the yard, still hung on its peg by the door. There was no note, no sign that she'd packed for a journey, planned or otherwise. No sign of struggle, no broken crockery, no overturned chair, nothing to suggest anyone had forced their way in or dragged her out. It looked, more than anything, as though she had simply stepped outside in the middle of getting breakfast and not come back in. Belle stood in the near pasture when the boy went looking, calm as ever, grazing the thin winter grass same as any other morning. If the mare had been ridden anywhere that night or that morning, she showed no sign of it. No lather dried into her coat, no mud past her fetlocks that the pasture itself wouldn't account for. Word went through the valley by midday. Men left their own chores half-finished to join the search. They walked the property line by line, checked the spring house, the root cellar, the old smokehouse out back, the barn loft. They walked the creek bottom both directions for the better part of a mile. They asked at every farm within riding distance whether anyone had seen Constance Finch on the road, in town, anywhere at all in the last day. The sheriff rode out from the county seat on the second day, more out of obligation than expectation that there was much a lawman could do in country that size. He walked the house himself, looked over the unfinished breakfast and the hanging shawl, and allowed that he'd seen plenty of disappearances in his years, and that most of them eventually explained themselves. A relative in another county, a debt walked away from, a grief too heavy to carry that finally just walked itself out the door. He said it gently, not as an accusation against Constance's character, but as the kind of plain accounting a man in his position learned to give. Nobody in the valley much liked the sound of it, even those who privately thought he might be right. Constance hadn't seemed unhappy, hadn't been seen arguing with anyone, hadn't drawn down her small savings at the bank in town. Whatever the sheriff's experience suggested about disappearances in general, this one refused to fit the shape of any of them cleanly. Nobody had seen anything. The search ran 3 days before exhaustion, and the practical needs of farms left untended for too long forced most of the searchers home, with promises to take it up again, with no answers gained and no theory that satisfied anybody. Not foul play, not accident, not a simple walk that had somehow gone wrong and left no trace at all. Theories circulated the rest of that week regardless, the way theories always did once the facts ran out. But none of them held together for long under questioning, and what unsettled people most wasn't any one theory, but the plain absence of evidence for all of them. Constance Finch had left nothing behind. Not a thread, not a footprint past the yard, not a single soul who could say they'd seen her in the last hours before she disappeared. The horse returned home. The widow never did. It was on the 3rd evening of the search, with men still combing the ridge country in the fading light, that someone thought to put Belle's saddle on and ride her out to cover ground faster than a man on foot could manage. She wouldn't take it. Otis Tanner, who'd come over from 2 farms off to help with the search, was the one who tried first, a man with 30 years of horse sense behind him and no patience for an animal acting up at a time like this. He approached her calm, the way he'd approach any horse, spoke low, got the blanket on her back without trouble. The moment he reached for the saddle itself, she sidestepped, not violent, not panicked, simply moving her body out from under his hands the way a horse moves away from something it has decided it doesn't want. He tried again. Same result. He tried a third time, more firmly, and she still didn't fight him exactly, didn't rear, didn't kick, didn't bare her teeth the way a genuinely dangerous animal might. She simply planted her feet and refused to be saddled, with a kind of patient, immovable stubbornness that unsettled Otis more than outright violence would have. "Never seen anything like it," he said afterward, standing at the pasture fence with his hat pushed back, looking at Belle the way a man looks at a puzzle he doesn't have the pieces for. She's not scared. She's not angry. She's just decided. Word of it spread fast, the way anything strange spreads fast in a valley already on edge from 3 days of fruitless searching. People assumed, reasonably enough at first, that the mare was grieving, that horses, like dogs, sometimes took an owner's absence hard, refused feed, refused work, pined visibly in ways a person could understand even if they couldn't fix it. Grief seemed the obvious answer, and for a few days the valley was content to let it stand. Then other people tried to ride her, and the pattern held in a way that grief alone didn't quite explain. A cousin of Constance's, a capable horsewoman who'd ridden Belle herself a dozen times before, came out from 2 counties over once word reached her, and got the same patient refusal Otis had. Constance's own hired man, who'd handled the mare for years without trouble, got it too. Children who'd ridden her bareback around the yard for the sheer joy of it, who knew nothing of saddles or bits or anything that might have spooked her, were met with the same calm, immovable resistance the moment anyone tried to actually mount her. She didn't buck. She didn't bite. She didn't run. She simply refused, every time, with a steadiness that started to feel less like grief and more like a decision the horse had made and intended to keep. A traveling preacher who came through that December, a man who claimed considerable experience with difficult horses from years of circuit riding, asked to try his hand at her, partly out of genuine confidence and partly, the hired man suspected, because he didn't care for being told a farm mare had bested every rider in the valley. He spent the better part of an hour with her, patient and quiet, working his way up from a halter to a blanket to the saddle itself, and got exactly as far as everyone else had, which was nowhere. She let him do everything but the one thing that mattered. The moment his weight shifted toward her back, she stepped clear, calm as ever, and stood waiting for him to try again or give it up. He gave it up. He told the hired man, before he rode on, that he'd handled stubborn horses and frightened horses and horses gone half wild from poor treatment, and that none of those things explained what he'd just seen. "That horse isn't refusing because she can't be ridden," he said. "She's refusing because she's decided she won't be. There's a difference, and I don't rightly know what to do with a horse that's made that kind of decision." Word of the preacher's failure spread the valley over within a week, and after that, fewer people tried. It seemed, increasingly, less like a problem to be solved than a fact to be lived around. The widow Finch's mare, once the gentlest horse in 3 counties, now standing untouched in her pasture, fed and watered and cared for by the hired man, ridden by no one. The only direction Belle would look was toward the ridge road. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. Winter came on hard that year, the way it tended to in that country once November turned, and the search for Constance Finch narrowed the way searches do when weeks pass without a single new fact to build on. The men who'd combed the creek bottom and the ridge country in the first days went back to their own farms, their own stock, their own families needing tending before the snow set in for good. A handful kept at it on weekends, more out of stubbornness than real hope, walking ground they'd already walked twice before. Belle, meanwhile, had taken up a habit that struck anyone who noticed it as more than ordinary restlessness. Several evenings a week, as dusk came down, she'd stand at the pasture gate, not grazing, not moving toward the barn the way she would for feed, simply standing with her head turned toward the distant tree line where the ridge road climbed out of the valley and disappeared into the hills. Always the same direction, Always the same stretch of ridge, a low saddle in the hills, maybe 2 miles off as the crow flew, country that had already been searched once in the first days and turned up nothing. People began to notice it the way people notice anything repeated often enough to stop looking accidental. Otis mentioned it to a few neighbors. A woman who passed the Finch property most evenings on her way home from her own chores said she'd taken to watching for it. The mare's still shape at the fence line, head up, facing the same patch of hillside evening after evening, as steady as a compass needle that had found its north and wouldn't be talked out of it. Nobody had an explanation that satisfied them. Horses didn't generally fix their attention on a single point of landscape for weeks running, not without a reason a person could name: feed, water, another animal, something. There was nothing on that stretch of ridge that anyone knew of. No barn, no shelter, nothing but timber and rock and the old trapper trails that had mostly gone unused since before the war. Otis took to watching her himself some evenings, standing well back from the fence so as not to disturb whatever it was she was doing, if she was doing anything at all, and not simply standing the way horses sometimes stood, facing whatever direction the wind or habit pointed them. He counted the evenings. Out of every 10, she faced that ridge on 8 or 9 of them, regardless of wind direction, regardless of weather, regardless of whether feed had just been put out behind her in the opposite direction. A horse will face into the wind most times if it's out of mind to, he told a neighbor, leaning on the same fence rail he'd leaned on since the first night he'd tried and failed to saddle her. This one's not facing into anything I can find a reason for. She's just looking. Same place, same way, like she's waiting on something to come down off that hill. The hired man, who saw Belle every day in a way occasional visitors didn't, noticed something else that took longer to put into words. She had stopped eating from the porch rail the way she always had with Constance. The careful breakfast scraps, now going untouched in the bucket he set out from habit more than expectation. She still ate her feed in the barn well enough. But the porch ritual, the one small daily exchange that had been hers and Constance's alone, had simply ended, as if some part of her understood that particular waiting had no point left in it. He mentioned this to Otis one evening, the two of them standing at the fence in the cold, watching Belle's still shape against the darkening tree line. "It's like she's split herself in two," he said. "Half of hers given up on the woman coming back through that door. The other half won't quit looking toward that hill. I don't know how a horse holds both those things at once, but that's what it looks like to me." Neither man had an answer for that. They stood at the fence a while longer, the way men in that valley tended to stand at fences when there was nothing useful left to say, and then went back to their own evenings, the question no closer to settled than it had been the day before. The night Belle broke through the pasture fence came in the second week of December, during a cold snap hard enough that most people had their stock shut up tight in the barn for the night. Constance's hired man found the damage the next morning. 2 rails down, splintered clean through rather than simply pushed over, the kind of break that told him the mare had hit that fence with real intent rather than wandering into it by accident. Belle herself was gone. He tracked her, with 2 neighbors who came to help, along a trail of hoof prints in the thin frozen snow, and found her 2 miles off, standing at the base of that same low ridge she'd been watching from the gate for weeks, exactly where her attention had always pointed. She let him catch her without trouble, the way she'd never resisted being caught, only saddled. He led her home. The fence got mended. Everyone assumed that would be the end of it, an odd night's wandering with no real meaning behind it. 3 nights later, she did again. One night, she broke through the pasture fence. After the second escape, a few of the men who'd kept up the search on weekends started following her deliberately rather than chasing her down after the fact. They'd let her out themselves in the last hour of daylight and trail her on foot or horseback at a distance, curious despite themselves whether the mare's fixation on that stretch of ridge meant anything at all, or whether they were chasing a grieving animal's confusion and calling it a clue because they badly wanted one. The first deliberate trip ran nearly 2 hours, the men following at a respectful distance as Belle picked her way up through timber that hadn't seen a worn path in years, moving with a steadiness that surprised everyone watching. Not the wandering, grazing pace of an animal without purpose, but something closer to a horse retracing a route it had walked before and knew well. She crossed 2 dry creek beds without hesitation, skirted a stand of deadfall that would have been easy enough to walk around blind, and arrived, finally, at the same low outcrop of rock the men had already searched once before, in the first days after Constance vanished. She stood there perhaps 20 minutes, head up, same as she stood at the pasture gate, and then turned and started back toward home on her own, without anyone needing to lead her, arriving at the broken fence line just as full dark settled over the valley. Otis brought a young deputy along on the second trip, partly to have an official witness to whatever they found, partly because the deputy himself had asked, having heard the story secondhand, and wanted to see it for himself before he believed a word of it. The deputy watched Belle make her way up through the same timber, the same dry creek crossings, with the same steady, deliberate pace, and admitted afterward that he'd come up expecting to see a confused animal wandering without purpose, and instead saw something that looked, in his own words, like a horse that knew exactly where she was going and had made the trip before. She made the trip 4 more times before the month was out, always to the same general stretch of hillside, always returning toward the farm before full dark without anyone needing to lead her. The men who followed searched the ground each time, walked the timber, checked the rock outcrops, looked for any sign of disturbed earth, any structure, any reason at all for a horse to keep returning to that one patch of unremarkable country. Each time, they found nothing. No shelter, no cave mouth, no sign that anyone, living or otherwise, had passed through that ground in months. She leads us right to the same spot, Otis said, after the third trip turned up empty same as the first 2, and there's nothing there. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if she's looking for something that's gone, or remembering something that already happened, or if horses just do this and we've never had cause to notice it before. People started asking the question out loud by then. The way questions get asked once enough strange facts pile up, that silence starts to feel like its own kind of denial. Was the horse trying to show them something? And if she was, why did the ground never give up anything to show? The Mare led 3 different groups to the same place. Each group left believing there was nothing there. There was one evening, in the first week of January, when Belle didn't come back before dark. The hired man had let her out at the usual hour, expecting the usual round trip, and when full dark came down with no sign of her at the broken fence line, he went up after her himself with a lantern, half afraid of what he might find. He found her exactly where she always stood, at the same outcrop the search parties had already walked twice, planted there in the cold with no more urgency than if it had still been daylight. She wouldn't be led. For the first time since the gatherings of her strangeness had begun, she resisted him outright, sidestepping the lead rope the same patient way she'd once sidestepped every saddle, until he simply stood with her in the dark and waited, unsure what else there was to do. She came home on her own a little before midnight, falling in a step beside him without complaint, as if whatever had held her there had simply finished holding her. He never told most of the valley about that night. It frightened him more than anything else that winter had shown him, though he couldn't have said exactly why a horse standing still in the dark should frighten a grown man more than a horse refusing every saddle in 3 counties already had. The break came with the worst storm of that winter, a blizzard in the 3rd week of January that dropped snow for the better part of 2 days and reshaped the whole hillside under drifts deep enough to bury a fence line. When the weather finally broke and men went out again to check on stock and clear roads, one of them, working the high ground above where Belle had always led her searchers, noticed something the snow itself had exposed rather than concealed. A drift had built up against a low rock outcrop in a way that revealed, where the wind had scoured one face nearly clean, the dark mouth of what looked like an old trapper's shelter, half collapsed and grown over with brush thick enough that it had gone unnoticed by every search party that had walked within 30 feet of it. It took 2 men the better part of an afternoon to clear enough brush and fallen timber to get inside properly. The hired man came up himself once word reached the farm, climbing the ridge on foot through snow still knee-deep in places, unwilling to wait for a full report secondhand. What they found settled nothing and explained everything, in the strange way that real answers sometimes do. There was evidence that Constance had sheltered there. Not recently, the signs made clear, but months earlier, sometime not long after she'd first disappeared. A bedroll, gone damp and half-rotted with the seasons. A small store of dry goods, mostly spoiled or taken by animals. A tin cup, the kind any farm kitchen kept a dozen of, sitting upright on a flat stone as though set down deliberately rather than dropped. In the corner, folded with more care than the rest of the shelter's disorder suggested, the hired man found a saddle blanket he recognized at once. It was Belle's, the same worn blanket Constance had used under her saddle for years, patched once at the corner with a scrap of different wool, a patch the hired man himself had watched her sew on one winter evening at the kitchen table. It had no business being here, 2 miles from the farm, unless she had carried it with her on purpose. The way a person carries a single familiar thing into an unfamiliar place because the weight of it in their hands means something words don't. He stood holding it a long moment, the wool gone stiff and gray with weather, and understood before he understood anything else in that shelter that whatever had brought her up this ridge, she hadn't meant to leave everything behind. She'd kept this much of her old life with her at least, and tucked inside an oiled cloth wrapper, protected from the worst of the weather, a handful of pages torn loose from what had once been a larger journal. The ink faded, but legible where the cloth had kept the damp out. The hired man stood in that low shelter along, while before he touched anything, the way a person stands in a room they've been told belonged to someone now gone. He had worked that farm 11 years, had seen Constance Finch nearly every day of every one of them, and he found, standing there, that he hadn't known her at all. Not really. Not in any way that would have let him guess at a single thing the pages were about to tell him. The pages didn't explain why she'd gone. Not fully. Not in any way that closed the question for good. They told a story the valley hadn't known to ask about. Fragments about a marriage that had been harder than anyone outside it had ever guessed. About years of careful, private endurance that had finally, quietly, run out. There was a line about wanting one season, just one, where nobody needed anything from her and nobody watched to see how she was managing. There was nothing about where she'd gone after the shelter, nothing to say whether she'd moved on to somewhere else entirely or whether the elements had finally caught up with what the years already had. Some of the older women in the valley, reading between what little the pages actually said, wondered if she'd been protecting someone with her silence all those years, a secret she'd carried alone rather than burden anyone else with. Others thought she'd simply wanted, after a lifetime of being watched and managed and asked after, a stretch of time that belonged to nobody but herself. Nobody could say for certain which was closer to true, or whether it was some third thing nobody had thought to guess it yet. It was, in the end, the kind of discovery that answered the wrong question. It explained where Constance had been for a while. It never explained where she went after, or whether she meant to be found at all. The hired man carried the pages down off the ridge himself, wrapped back in their oiled cloth, and turned them over to the sheriff, who read them in the kitchen of the Finch house with the same careful, unhurried attention he'd given the unfinished breakfast and the hanging shawl months before. He allowed, when he finished, that this matched the shape of disappearances he'd seen before better than anything else the valley had offered as theory. Not an accident, not a crime, but a woman who had finally, after years of careful endurance, simply walked out from under a life that had grown too heavy to keep carrying and had not wanted to be followed. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way he'd said his first assessment back in November, plain and without judgment, and this time fewer people in the valley argued with him. The pages had a way of settling old assumptions even as they raised new questions. People who had thought of Constance Finch as simply reserved now wondered how much of that reserve had been a kind of armor built up over 12 years of widowhood on top of however many years of marriage before it, and how much they had mistaken for contentment what had actually been quiet endurance. The hired man read the pages himself more than once in the weeks that followed, turning them over the way Otis turned over an unsolved puzzle, looking for something he might have missed the first time that would tell him where she'd gone after the shelter, or why, or whether she was even still living. He never found it. The pages simply stopped, mid-thought in places, the way a person's writing stops when there's no longer any reason to keep explaining themselves to paper. Belle's strangeness ended the same week the journal pages came to light, though it ended in its own time, on its own terms, the way it had started. She didn't take a writer again immediately. The hired man tried the morning after the shelter was found, more out of habit than real expectation, and got the same gentle, immovable refusal she'd given everyone for 2 months running. He tried again 3 days later. This time she let the saddle settle without moving away from it, though she still wouldn't take a bit, still sidestepped the bridle with the same quiet insistence as always. It came back gradually after that, not all at once. By the second week of February, she let the hired man ride her at a walk around the near pasture. Nothing more, his weight settling on her back for the first time in nearly 2 months while he held his breath without quite meaning to. By March, she was carrying riders again the way she always had, calm and steady, as if whatever obligation had been keeping her from it had finally, quietly, run its course. A neighbor boy, one of the children who'd ridden her bareback before all of this began, was given the honor of being the first child back in the saddle, and reported afterward that she'd felt exactly the same as she always had, as though the 2 strange months had simply never happened. Nobody could point to the exact day it changed completely. It simply was 1 week, the way it always had been, and people noticed only in looking back that the change had lined up near enough with the week the shelter was found and the search for Constance Finch had effectively ended, unresolved, the way it remains unresolved still. People in the valley argued about it for years afterward, the way they argued about most things that never got a clean answer. Did the horse know where Constance had gone? In some way nobody could explain or test. Did she remember the route from carrying her mistress there herself, sometime in the days right after she vanished, on one of those evening rides nobody else had witnessed? Was she trying, in whatever way a horse tries to communicate anything, to lead the search to a place she somehow understood mattered? Or was the whole thing coincidence, dressed up afterward into a story because the story felt better, more meaningful, than admitting a grieving animal had simply fixed her attention on an arbitrary stretch of hillside, and the valley had gone looking for a connection that was never really there? Nobody ever proved any version of it. Otis, who'd handled more horses in his life than he could rightly count, said only that he'd never known an animal to behave quite that way before or since, and that he didn't put much stock in horses understanding things the way people understood them, but that he also couldn't explain, in 30 years of horse sense, why a calm, well-trained mare would refuse every experienced rider in the valley for 2 straight months, and then simply stop, the same week a half-rotted shelter gave up. Its secret's 2 miles from her own pasture gate. Some in the valley settled on the simplest explanation available, the one that needed nothing from a horse's memory or understanding at all. That Belle had carried Constance up that ridge herself, sometime in the first days after she vanished, on one of those evening rides nobody else had witnessed, and that the mare's strange behavior afterward was nothing more than an animal returning, again and again, to the last place she remembered her rider dismounting. It was tidy. It required no mysticism, only a route a horse had walked once and hadn't forgotten. It also failed to explain why Belle had refused every saddle entirely, rather than simply favoring the ridge route the way a creature of habit might. Others thought the mare's refusal had nothing to do with the ridge at all, that the 2 things, the refusing and the staring, had simply happened to occur in the same stretch of months and gotten woven together afterward into a single story, because a single story was easier to tell and easier to believe than 2 unrelated strangenesses sitting side by side. Grief explained the refusal well enough on its own. This version held. Habit, or some trick of terrain and wind, explained the staring. The valley had simply wanted a connection badly enough to find one. A smaller number, mostly older women who'd known Constance longest, leaned toward something they were less willing to put plainly into words, that some animals understood more about the people who loved them than anyone gave them credit for, and that whatever Belle had been doing those 2 months, refusing riders and walking that ridge and finally, quietly, stopping both at once, it hadn't been confusion. It had been waiting on something. And once the shelter was found and whatever waiting required of her was finished, she'd simply gone back to being a horse again. Old-timers, telling the story years later, tended to settle on the one fact that nobody could argue with, the one detail that outlasted every competing theory. The mare stopped refusing riders the same week Constance Finch's journal pages were found. Nobody ever explained that either. The pasture gate at the old Finch place still stands, mended many times over the years since, looking out toward that same low stretch of ridge in the distance. The hired man stayed on for a time after, tending the place as best he could, until the property eventually passed to a cousin who had little use for it beyond the land itself. Belle lived out her years there, gentle to the end, ridden by whoever needed her. The 2 strange months of that winter folding slowly in a local memory, the way most strange things eventually do, talked of less, then talked of only by the old-timers, then talked of mainly when a stranger asked. Travelers passing on the road sometimes ask about the place, having heard some thin version of the story secondhand. Locals point toward the hills without much ceremony and let them wonder. Some evenings, a horse standing at that fence line still turns toward the ridge. And for a moment, somebody remembers Belle.